And now, delighted to welcome Seth back to give a talk entitled Today's Clubland. Thank you, Seth.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to come here, and of course I always come here when I've got a book to flog. This book came out of the way that my previous book was essentially a sort of indiscreet history of London Clubland, and so the first question most people asked me was, well, that's all very interesting on club history, but what are the clubs like now? Tell us about them today. So I've essentially written a guidebook that's the kind of guidebook to London Clubland today that I would have wanted 20 years ago when I started frequenting these places, with little indiscreet asides and bits of trivia and everything you could possibly want to know. It's fair to say that not all clubs universally were terribly keen on my embarking on this, as you can probably tell from the response that I had. And this is not atypical. To be fair, this particular club didn't then go on to say, well, if you're going to publish the thing anyway, we'd better go on this. But as you'll know, Clubland is not only immediately recognisable, but it's actually very much a sort of shadow of its former self, I would argue. The book contains listings of 133 clubs in London today. 55.
Yes.
Yes. Sort of, yes.
Page 422.
It doesn't have an entry, but it does get mentioned. There are 55 historic clubs, and there are 78 new ones that have entries of their own. To give you an idea, just if you look at the St James's area, you can see the black dots represent current clubs that are there. It has old and new clubs. And the pale grey dots are the former establishments there. If you want more of a sense of what's vanished, just go a little further north of Piccadilly, and you'll see the full scale across Mayfair of former clubland and how much there is. In fact, if you wander down somewhere like Dover Street, you're literally going wall to wall, club after club. Fortunately, the book does have, amongst its many bits of trivia, a complete index at the back of every London clubhouse that's ever existed. So you can do a little walking tour.
Does that include drones?
There is a bit on fictional clubs, but not drones specifically. But that is where I come on to a little excerpt I thought it would be fun to give you from the book. I do have a section where I go into archetypal personality types that you'll find in clubs, and naturally these are all entirely imaginary people, not based on any real life individuals. But we start with the consummate clubman, what every club member, male or female, wants to be: ever present, dependable, a patient listener with an inexhaustible supply of amusing anecdotes that are seldom repeated. You then have the good thing backwoodsman, dear old Sir Desmond. Probably the most common type of member. This individual takes great pride in their club membership, but only visits the club maybe once or twice a year, if that. They nonetheless believe that the club is a good thing and selflessly go on paying their subscription, even though they rarely use it. Visits are a special occasion to be cherished. More easily identifiable is the peasant. Tells the same 4 or 5 anecdotes about the club over and over again, pedantically taking great pains to point out where other people usually have the details wrong. Usually gets the details wrong. The frustrated retiree. Once at the top of their profession as a chief executive, ambassador, professor or similar, they're now retired. They miss wielding power and influence. They cannot understand why the club has not already made them its chairman, and they regularly circulate epic memoranda to their colleagues, spelling out in excessive detail everything that everyone else is doing wrong. The fantasist. A surprisingly common clubland figure who escapes from the tedium of their day job by coming into the club to fantasise about being a James Bond figure, rubbing shoulders with spies, diplomats and statesmen, very poor at small talk and extremely awkward, often fabricates highly elaborate tales about what they do outside the club. The not so closet fascist.
No, she's not a fascist.
They see the club as a place to banter, which they understand to mean freedom from any consequences, as they air a series of extreme right-wing views, which they know could land them in jail in the wider world, but enjoy the freedom of the club to goad others into a sort of contest as to who can say the most outrageously racist, sexist, homophobic, or just generally disagreeable abuse. If questioned, they will claim that they are traditional Tory, ignoring that traditional Tories would have no truck with this sort of nonsense. A bedside photograph of Augusto Pinochet is left. And then their counterpart is the left-wing contrarian. One of life's natural contrarians, they enjoy the frisson of being the most Bolshevik person in the room.
Solidarity, comrades.
Despite not actually being that left-wing and having really rather unremarkable middle-of-the-road moderate views. They have therefore contrived to join the most reactionary club they could find for the stimulation of being in a state of near constant argument with all the other members. The consultant has a highly impressive curriculum vitae on paper, which conceals the fact that the reason why they are a daily fixture in the club in the daytime is that they do not actually have a job, but instead attempt to practice some ill-defined consultancy role from a writing table in the club, whining and dining prospective clients over long, boozy lunches, all the while denying to the club's management that they are carrying out any business on the premises. It is not unknown for the club to be contacted for details of their whereabouts by HMRC, to whom they may owe substantial sums. The obsessive anorak. These are found in every club that has a theme. The obsessive anorak is inordinately attached to that theme, and they can bawl for England on the topic. Highly knowledgeable, with flashes of real insight, but not terribly easy to talk to due to their ongoing obsessions. The author of this book is several of the personality types listed here, most obviously an obsessive anorak. The Traveller. A frequent international globe-trotter, the Traveller lives entirely out of clubs, whether their own ones spread across the globe or a reciprocal club in each city. On arriving at a new destination, they immediately make a beeline for the bar, trading red-hot gossip from their last destination. More common in the press clubs of the world, the traveller is often a foreign correspondent, they will often stop off in London. The freeloader. They join the club for free food and wine. They will be a regular fixture at dinners and drinks dues, forever having forgotten their wallet, and asking a passing acquaintance to stand them dinner or a drink. Nobody will have ever got a drink out of them. When they eventually expire, aged 95, there will be general incredulity at the revelation in their obituary that they were a multimillionaire all along. The association freeloader. An offshoot of the above, the association freeloader isn't actually a member of the club. Nevertheless, they are very adept at turning up to the club more frequently than most of its own members, courtesy of having very carefully studied the calendars of when various associations and societies are holding their private events in the building, preferably free ones. You will usually see them elbowing their way into the bar straight after the event, scooping up any nibbles in sight, sometimes being swept into a conveniently extracted carrier bag. The antiquarian. The antiquarian is motivated by many things, a love of knowledge, wisdom, reason and compassion, but mainly by a passion for fondling and caressing old books. They are one of the few members of the club to use its library, diligently doing so on most weekdays, fueled by regular cups of tea between serious bouts of scholarly study. The opinionated malcontent. Funnily enough, I had a bit of feedback on this from a member of a club which will remain nameless. Saying, "My God, it's like he's been in the club recently." They are very, very angry about everything. And they suspect some deep-rooted conspiracy lay at the heart of the club, seeing themselves as a latter-day Woodward and Bernstein who is going to uncover it. They will pigeonhole passers-by, launching into a monologue and asking them what they make of some lurid rumour that they have semi-invented. Any denial of that rumour will only further convince them that they are close to uncovering the truth. They will usually get up to ask a hostile question at the AGM, and they often stand for committee, staff regard them with distaste for their habit of telling everyone else how they should be doing their jobs. And finally, the club bore. If you spend any time in a club, you will not need the club bore to be described to you. You do not need to wait long to find them. They will find you. So that gives you an idea of some of these personality types found within Clubland. Now, as a sort of background, clubs themselves are often seen as being quintessentially British, by which I mean, of course, they started with versions in Italy. This is the Circolo degli Uniti in Siena, and the American antecedent, the South River Club in what's now Maryland, just outside of Annapolis, which was fully going by the 1690s, before White's was even a chocolate shop, let alone before it was a club. If that sounds fanciful, they were already using a candidates book with black balls and white balls to elect members. They had club banquets, they had club rituals, they had all the things that you would expect to find in a club long before we found it. And it was indeed people who were trading internationally, Greek coffee merchants, French waiters and chefs, Italian hospitality impresarios who helped set up White's. You can see White's here, somewhat contemptuously portrayed by Hogarth, with bailiffs accosting a member as he's coming outside. And Hogarth took an even more dim view of the inside. It shows less clearly on the painting version of the gambling hell. It's clearer on the print version, but the members have actually accidentally set fire to the building. And of course, White's did burn down around the time of this print. They had to move premises as a result. I've spoken a bit about clubs and who frequents them, but I would actually like to, at this stage, just throw it open a little and ask you, what do you think makes a club? What is a club, and what do I mean? Feel free to shout out. I know I may regret saying this at a new Sheridan gathering, but what do you regard as being a club?
A place with shared interests, whether it be film or conversation.
Usually, but not always. But yes, absolutely, that's a big part of bringing people together.
Convivial enterprise. Convivial enterprise.
Convivial, yes, that may be news to some clubs, but yes.
I think that exclusivity is a big thing, right? There's us and everybody else.
It's a distinction between members and people who are not members. Right?
Yes.
Yes, well, by definition, it's not open to the public, so there's that.
Somewhere to get away from everyone
Yeah,
else.
but really,
Yes, that's a big part of the appeal in terms of it being something that isn't like everyday life almost. What else?
I'm going to say something very controversial. Sex, drugs and rock and roll. Because that's what they used to be about in the 90s.
Yes, no, very true, very true. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll in that sense, and some of them still are. But I think we'll probably want to maintain a low profile, and of course, the mandatory disclaimer for the online video of this that none of the named 133 clubs in the book necessarily conforms to them. But yes, the idea of a club has evolved, and it's something. It has different meanings. Obviously, we don't mean the 14th century word for a stick with which to hit people, but the original form of it was actually unclubbable. It's when people would meet up in the back room of a pub or a tavern in the upstairs room. And then the time would come to pay the communal bill, and certain people would not cover their fair share, and they were deemed to be unclubbable. That was the original idea. And then from the idea of being unclubbable, this is a pre-English Civil War idea. Then post-Civil War, in the Republic, you have the idea of unclubbability, the people we don't want to be around, tedious people who repeat anecdotes and so forth, as well as not being trusted. And then 20 years later, you start to get the reverse. You start to get the idea of being clubbable and of clubbability. And then the virtues of the kind of company that you seek, and the dependability and the reliability of that within the community. And then, barely a decade later, you then have actually the word club evolves in that way. It's really the 1730s where they kick off in a very, very big way, and there are a number of clubs I've named here which all sort of almost event zero at once. The Royal Society still exists to this day, but it's not formed anymore as a club. Society of Dilettanti still exists as a dining club within Brooks's. The Sublime Society of Beefsteaks is a sort of antecedent of what's now the Beefsteak Club. And White's, I mean, I mentioned it was essentially a room with illegal gambling going on around the back, so it was rather easier to not be raided by the authorities to say, we're a private members club, this is outside of your jurisdiction. And so, yes, when the fire of 1733 burns it down, they do say, well, we're actually making a lot more money from the gambling house around the back. Why don't we just reopen the whole building dedicated to a club? And it's really from about the 1760s that they start to regularise that, but it's an idea that's fleshed out then. This you may recognise as Gilray's portrait of the Union Club. Not a terribly flattering portrait, it has to be said, but it's important as the first member-owned club in London. It moves on from these 18th century proprietary clubs where they existed for one reason and one reason alone, which is a landlord wanted to profit as much as possible at the expense of the members. And when the members start to jointly own the Union Club, that's important because their rule book is being held up all through the 19th century when these club openings happen. And they are going clause by clause through the Union Club as a template and saying, we'll adopt that, we'll amend that, but that is really document zero. And even these older clubs, White's, Boodle's, Brooks's, named after either their proprietors or their managers, later have management buyouts and convert from being proprietary clubs to being member-owned clubs in that way. You also have this massive 19th century expansion of clubs, and you can sort of physically see that in certain bits of London, either whether they still are clubs or were built as clubs. And that's really a process driven by the Industrial Revolution. You're really looking at a huge expansion in wealth, and a number of people with disposable incomes who want to join these aristocratic citadels and are told you can't come in. So they say, fine, we'll set up our own inclusive clubs for, rather than for 300 people, there are for 1,000 people. Only they then realise that they don't want to be that inclusive and they close the doors, which itself helps fuel the creation of further spin-off clubs. So if you're tracing the sort of growth of clubs in London, you have about 8 in the 1810s. By the 1830s, you're looking at 30. By the 1860s, you're looking at 60. And by the 1890s, you're looking at 400. 55 or so of those 400 survive now. They start to compete with one another on their more substantive offerings, on things like the splendour of their clubhouses and their facilities and their interiors. And you get things like libraries that become a major marketing point, and technology. Pall Mall is, of course, the first first street in the UK to be entirely lit by gas light, and people were marvelling at this. And the clubhouses were the first buildings to be part of that process. Clubs are later the first to have electrical lighting, the first to have a passenger lift, and so forth. And they even bring technology to do with scale. So, for example, if you look at the kitchens of the Reform Club developed by Alexis Soyer, this is about bringing the principles of the Industrial Revolution to club catering. Instead of catering quality meals for 6 people, you're doing this for 200 people at a go. And it's very much about trying to increase the pace of this. All clubs involve a certain element of trade-off in how they do this. And there are some economic factors, and we can go into some sort of examples about that as to whether you want to be an expensive and affordable club, whether you want to be a small or a large club. If we go for the sort of classic, well-known model of a very, very expensive, very small membership club, I mean, I simply use White's here as an example of that. That is tenable. They're more or less capped at 1,500 members. The subscriptions are not cheap, but they can afford to do that because they follow that model. You can also continue to have an expensive club with no necessary cap on the membership. I mean, this is the RAC, is the classic model, where they have 17,000 members. They have facilities the other clubs can only dream of. They have the marble-floored swimming pool, they have a Turkish bath, 6 bars, 3 dining rooms, a country clubhouse in Epsom with 2, I think, golf courses as part of it. But the catch is that if you have 17,000 members, it's not quite the same level of familiarity of going to the barman and saying the usual please and knowing all the other members by sight, quite the reverse. So you do have that sort of trade-off that's necessary. You can also go for a small membership club that's affordable. It's not an easy thing.
You show it in club.
Well, I used I use the example of the Beefsteak Club, and the thing about the Beefsteak is they do own the freehold of their building. That has enabled them to do that. And crucially, they actually own the entire building. And really, I mean, there are extra bits, like there is a solitary bedroom and so on, but they really are just one room. And they've made a decision, we're going to make that the centre of club life. It's going to be just about doing the dining experience incredibly well in that way. It helps that they sublet most of the rest of the building and live off the income of that in no small degree. That's actually a really common business model in European clubs. You'll very often find European clubs are on the first floor, they own the building below, it's shops and cafes and bars. And it means that they can stay there indefinitely. But unless you have that sort of huge capital income influx to begin with, it's very, very difficult to make that model work. And you can have an affordable club with a mass membership. It's a classic trade-off. I mean, I use here as an example the Mildmay Club, a really well-preserved working men's club just off the Newington Green in Stoke Newington. This is the billiard room. It's an amazingly preserved, not just billiard tables, but you will find the 19th century cues still have their members' names written on them. But again, it is able to sustain that at £35 a year because it has 6,000 members. So it's a trade-off that you're constantly pursuing. And what makes sense of all of these very dull, dry management decisions is actually the culture. And is the cultural trade-off of the club. And it comes back to the point that was made about having a theme in a club. Very often, it's a formal theme. You can do it by profession, whether you do this for professional clubs. Around the military, whether it's a single services club or a mixed services club, you can have individual specific hobbies where there's an obvious topic of conversation. You can do this for political clubs with a shared world look and ideology. You can do this around literature, whether it's professionally being involved in literature or keen amateurs in that way. You can do it around shared educational background, where this has been done. You can certainly do it amongst expat groups, and I include the Caledonian Club within that, because Scots in London very much often argue that it's in that light. It's worth mentioning there used to be a lot more of these, as with all of these clubs. So, for instance, there was, actually, 2 French clubs. There was a Brazilian club, there was more than one Spanish club that existed, and there was until, a German Athenaeum existed until August 1914, and I think you can work out why that's very abruptly closed.
There was the Commonwealth Club as well, that was my club.
Indeed. You've got the City of London, which has its own culture around the livery companies and so forth, and so its own clubs in that way. And you can have individual sports or general sporting clubs. It's also worth pointing out that you very often have informal themes that aren't spelt out. You'll typically find that in the more aristocratic clubs. And very often on the outside looking in, people say, well, they're all very similar, but actually the members of these clubs are very different. White's is much more a place where you're more likely to find people in finance. Boodle's is much more somewhere where people with country pursuits and country backgrounds are. Brooks is much more of a sort of Whiggish club. Crucially, even if you have a theme, the theme can and will evolve and change over time. There's nothing in any of Brooks's governing documents that says we're going to have a sort of Whiggish tradition. This is just how several centuries of membership have panned out. The Garrick, interestingly enough, does say that it's very much a club for actors and patrons of acting. It says nothing about the law, and yet it's an incredibly popular club amongst the legal profession. That's partly because of the number of lawyers who are patrons of acting, but actually, a lot of it is happenstance and chance. There were a number of historic lawyers' clubs closer to barristers' chambers that all went bust for one reason or another. It is geographically closer to where a lot of these barrister chambers are. It became the known place. So gradually these clubs do evolve.
Is that the one that the Sheridan Club is?
You're thinking of the Sheridan Club in the Rumpole of the Bailey stories, which is a spoof of the Garrick Club.
Yes.
Clearly a spoof, absolutely. Which is how Mr. Delikanakis came here, but that's a story for afterwards. It's worth mentioning that things that bind people together in this way, you have a dining culture. I think dining is actually an incredibly important component in a lot of these clubs because you're stuck with one another for at least an hour. It's a less transient conversation than you would have, say, in the bar. And by definition, and I use the Garrick's main club table here as an example, club tables are really fascinating. Not that I'm here to plug another book, but there is an excellent visual book on club interiors that's just come out, and it has on the end papers the measurements of individual club tables, which I find quite fascinating. But the whole point of a club table, yes, I've spent too long doing this, but the whole point of a club table, by definition, is you're probably going to have about 5 people around you, and 1 or 2 of them may be quite dull, but the chances are 2 or 3 of them will be quite interesting. And those aren't bad odds in this day and age. And for something a little more informal, there is, of course, drinking culture and clubs, no strangers to developing cocktails of their own, and some of them are quite lethal, my God. But you also have things that are shared cultural points that are to do with the theme of the club. So not all clubs will have a sporting culture. They might have organised away days and so on, but a lot of them will take a long, hard look at themselves and say, we can't do a cricket green properly in the middle of London, so we're just not going to bother. And that's part of the trade-offs that you have to make as a club. You either decide we're going to do this really, really well, or is it actually an unnecessary extravagance in that way? In looking at binding the members together in this way, you have the appeal of sociability and fellowship. You have the appeal of common company. And it's worth bearing in mind that actually when clubs reached their height in the 19th century, it's still a fairly hidebound culture in Britain where it's just not the done thing to talk to somebody who's not in your immediate social circle unless you've been properly introduced. And the exception for that is the club. Because if somebody's a fellow member of your club, then by definition, they must know someone who knows someone who knows someone who is in your circles. And so you can talk quite freely. So they were very much about breaking down barriers. I mean, if we take a slightly more theoretical model, and I promise you I am going somewhere with this, looking at Robert Putnam's work on social networks and social capital. And he argues that all social capital is really down to two things. He calls it bridging capital and bonding capital. Bonding capital is when we talk to people like ourselves in our own communities, and bridging capital is when we outreach in other ways to talk to people in different communities. And the point he makes rather persuasively is in every community, you actually need both. You can't exist in isolation totally. He argues that if you don't have bonding capital, then you have no cohesion to bring you together. And if you don't have bridging capital, you're not a club, you're a sect. So you do need actually an element of both, and it's how you manage to balance those out, which very often defines the relationship and the atmosphere and the culture of a club. Now back to dining culture, it's worth saying that it exists on different scales. I mean, you have large-scale banquets like this. Yes, we can get into the anecdote of that possibly afterwards, but you can also have small intimate dinners. And the way that clubs are suited to that in different ways actually forges the different relationships, whether it's part of the hearty club table gathering or whether it's part of the we want a quiet word in your ear. And discretion is important. When we think of confidentiality and discretion in clubs, we tend to think of something like this, the porter's lodge of the garrick, keeping people out. Actually, probably a more accurate rendition, I would suggest, even though clubs may not thank me for this, is Yes Minister and Sir Humphrey's quiet chats in the club after hours. But there is then the assumption that you can hammer out your differences with somebody you may not want to be seen with in public and you may not normally talk to. But a club will respect your privacy in just being able to have a chat with someone that way. We also think of them, because of this very fusty reputation, as being these very hidebound institutions, but when they were at their height in the 19th century, they were very fashionable places. And, there were constantly people seen buzzing in and out at all hours. It's worth actually saying that accommodation played a big part in their rise in the 19th century, not least because prior to the Savoy Hotel opening in the 1880s and the Ritz opening in the 1890s, and they're revolutionising hotels in London, you didn't want to admit you were staying in a hotel prior to that. It was synonymous with saying, I've been staying in a brothel. So the club was a reputable alternative. It was safe, it was central, it was dependable. And actually, if you use clubs, I mean, I've never yet needed to stay in a London club because I live in London, but I stay in a lot of clubs and I travel. And one of the things I find is that you do get a certain camaraderie of people at the breakfast table of those who are residents in the club, whether they're country members who've popped in or whether they are visitors from reciprocal clubs. And they're a lot more forthcoming in a way just you wouldn't be in a hotel, you wouldn't be in a commercial setting. It might seem a little bit strange. I've perhaps slightly scurrilously described invented tradition, because I think all tradition is invented, but that's not a bad thing. This is the games of cricket that they play at Bucks in the bar, and indeed they've drawn the wickets onto the bar permanently now. They've got some metal rivets doing that. Nowhere in its wildest imagination that's a commercial venue that's worried about things like liability and health and safety would ever countenance this. It's mad. It's also brilliant. It gives it its character. And so I think actually there's something of the shared rituals of these places that do make them memorable. I'm flattered that I'm this far into a talk and not that many people have yelled resign yet. A few.
Resign!
Thank you.
Are you going to mention the drones? Well,
I wasn't planning on it, but since it's the second question, I may get around to it. Buildings as a sort of shared space. And it's worth pointing out that club members are often on rather more modest incomes than you might imagine, but by clubbing together, literally the dictionary definition is to club together to defray costs, they can jointly afford to while away their hours in rather luxurious and splendid settings. You also have the importance of power, the importance of being at the centre of things, the importance of sensing that something is going on. and the importance of belonging to something more widely, which is why reciprocals come in. It's actually quite disarming to meet like-minded clubs around the world. I had a couple of questions beforehand on surviving women's clubs, and so I will talk a little bit about this, as you might imagine. It's an interesting sort of historical quirk as to why clubs evolved into the idea of gentlemen's clubs. We haven't tended to think of them as an entirely male-only atmosphere until about the 1950s. And I'll explain why, because not only were the earliest clubs, including White's, founded by Mr. and Mrs. Bianco, and of course Mrs. Bianco actually ran it herself for as long as she did with her husband. But you then find that actually not only are there mixed-sex clubs dating as far back as 1770, but they have a rival in the late 18th and early 19th century. The rival is the salons. Salons really with a capital S. And these are sort of vast facilities, now sadly demolished, but they were on places like King Street, just off St. James's Square. This is Almack's. And the salons had one crucial difference to clubs, even though their surroundings visually looked quite similar. You didn't have membership. You couldn't be a member. Instead of having the rights to go in, you bought tickets by the night, as you might do for, say, visiting a nightclub. You negotiate the sales individually. Only all of the tickets were controlled by aristocratic lady patronesses, which meant that your only way of securing access night after night was to flatter, toady, grovel and crawl to the proprietor as much as possible. And as a result, the idea of having clubs where you'd be able to go by right without having to ask and beg a proprietor became very, very popular. So the two existed side by side really until the 1860s, the women-dominated salons and the male-dominated clubs. And it's no coincidence that when the last of the salons shut down in the 1860s coincides perfectly with when women's clubs explode. You also have a coincidence of women are allowed to own property for the first time from the 1860s. So all these things coming together. And you do get an explosion of women's clubs. I've counted at least 86 of them. So that was a fair number. This is the Empress Club, for example, which was on Dover Street. The facade of the building is still there, although because it was bombed during the war, the main dining hall here no longer exists. But they were really quite pleasant and sumptuous. And just as a sort of partial map, I think I've shown this in the previous talk, this is a slice of Clubland, circa 1910, and I've just marked up blue for the women's clubs and purple for the mixed-sex clubs. So again, numerically, these weren't anything like parity. It was a significant slice of Clubland, a good sort of 1/4 or 1/5 of Clubland was either women only or mixed sex. Why did they not survive? Well, several things. One was to do with how they were funded. Firstly, they tended to depend, rather like the salons, on lady patronesses. Partly because women had less financial agency during the 19th century, less independence. They tended not to control household budgets. Therefore, although women would pay subscriptions, the club would depend for its shortfall not on a large number of male members digging deep and saying, this is going to be the club endowment. They just simply have their annual losses written off by a well-wisher. So in the case of the Ladies Athenaeum, Lady Randolph Churchill, Winston Churchill's mother, is bankrolling them. She dies in 1921. They close a few years later. This is a very common story when the founder or the patroness dies 30 years after founding. They're no longer financially viable. They're shutting down in huge numbers between the 1920s and the 1950s. There is an intermediate phase where we have the Ladies' Annex. And if you want to see an example of the Ladies' Annex, you'll find it in the Oxford and Cambridge Club. If you're facing the building, you'll see on the left-hand side there's a little separate area. That was originally purchased as the Ladies' Annex. The point of the Ladies' Annex was with all of these women's clubs closing down, a fair number of displaced female members said, well, we'd like to join the clubs that are solvent, which are men only. And they're told, no, we don't want you into the main building in any way. But what we'll do is we'll buy another house next door or across the street and you'll have most of the club's facilities, which makes no financial sense whatsoever because you're doubling your overheads whilst having maybe 20 or 30% extra members. So unsurprisingly, all of the ladies' annexes went bust between the 50s and the 60s, which coincides with when women start being elected to the men-only clubs. So it's a very sort of complex, interrelated relationship. Clubs do go into a long decline all through the post-war years, but it really is a process which actually starts with World War I. This is obviously an example from the National Liberal Club, the members of staff who went off to war, those who never came back. The crucial thing is that for the generation that lives through the war, it's such a defining generational event that, quite understandably, they look down on people who didn't serve. That includes, after a while, people too young to have served. And so the clubs do very much assume the culture in the 20s and 30s of a wartime reunion society for those who served with distinction. As a result, they stopped recruiting younger members. They rather look down on them, and as far as they can see, there's no problem. The club is full, the members have a great deal in common, everybody's paying their subscription, but they were all born between about 1890 and 1900, and they're getting older and older and older. And if you wonder why it is that so many clubs closed down in the 60s and 70s because so many of their members have died of old age, it's precisely because they've had this ticking demographic time bomb to which they've belatedly woken up to. They also have their tastes become rather more set in their ways as a result. So you have this cartoon from the 1930s showing a new member of the Athenaeum asking the way to the cocktail bar. Bear in mind that clubs were doing innovative things a century earlier, but by now it's my God, a cocktail, how dare you? And so instead of being these vibrant, thrusting, exciting, glamorous places where things are happening, there's not much going on already by the interwar years. And then there's a further death knell, which is... Well, thank you. There's a club for everyone, that's what I'll say, Charles. But the Second World War has a second hammer blow, which is club buildings. You have at least 30 clubs that are directly bombed out. You have several dozen more that are damaged in the war. And as a result, you start to find buildings that were sort of peripherally damaged, like the Army and Navy Club, due some minor moderations and so the 70s and 80s are really sort of nadir of Clubland, but it actually starts to get a modest resurgence in no small part due to this place, the Groucho Club. The Groucho Club argues that it is an anti-club that's doing away with these fusty old Pall Mall establishments, because instead it's going to be a proprietary club, just like the 18th century clubs. It's going to be a scandalous, racy place with a certain amount of illicit after-hours drug taking, just like the 18th century clubs. That it's going to be a sort of vibrant place for the arts, just like the 18th century club. Essentially, you can see where I'm going on this. And it acts as something of a gateway drug to a new generation who would never be caught dead in a fusty old club. It starts to say, not only is this very nice, but there are these old clubs with marvellous paintings and assets and things that they've built up over centuries. And if you look at the surge in traditional clubs, it really starts in the late 1980s from the people who've started looking at these places. And there continues to be a cottage industry really from the 90s, and then in the last decade we've had about 70 new clubs set up. I mean, one of the more well-known ones here you can see is Robin Burley's 5 Hertford Street. Of course, his father, Mark Burley, had actually set up half a dozen different clubs when they were doing really badly. All through the 60s, 70s and 80s, he's opening new clubs, he's making a success of it. That's really, really difficult, though. And some of them are very, very individual, and Burley has a great deal of success precisely because he has a high degree of confidence in his taste. But what you're fighting against is what I call the 3 to 50-year rule. It's a moment of maximum danger, and that is that if you are a sort of new, buzzy, exciting club that's just launched in the last 3 years, it's very easy to have lots of positive publicity. You're in the gossip columns all the time. Celebrities are seen coming in and out because it's new. If you're more than 50 years old, you are an established presence. You're known as a brand, as we say now. You're trusted in that way. But in between, you're just a business. You're just trading on your reputation and your offer. And that's really, really hard for clubs that are past that 3-year mark. And I say this because there's a great deal of press coverage whenever a new club opens, but there's very little coverage of when they close down. And the average lifespan of a new club, I identify, is about 3 years. If you look at the accounts filed in Companies House, this is all public domain information for new clubs that have opened. It's not unusual for 18 months after a club is launched, it will have debts of between 23 and 78 million pounds, on an annual turnover of between 5 and 9 million pounds, where even if you imagine that they're doing unbelievably well and they're making, say, a 10% profit on their turnover, and that's a very optimistic view, those sums are not going to add up. So you can see why the odds are stacked against them, and it's very, very tough. So some clubs have navigated and done really disgustingly well, but the vast majority have not. And usually aren't warned in the press and aren't noticed when they quietly close down. So there's sort of a little closing comparison. Newer clubs aren't lumbered with listed buildings, which are expensive to maintain, also inflexible to maintain. They can be a lot more creative in how they use their space and how they bring their members together physically in that way. They often trade much more on the basis of luxury offerings. Older clubs typically don't have multi-million-pound mortgages to pay. They'll either own their freehold outright, or they have very, very long leases, often on a peppercorn rent from a very sympathetic landlord for 100, 150 years at a time. That means they've got a lot more security of tenure, and they can plan around building up an institution there. They've also built up a serious number of assets, not just paintings as cultural assets, but even things like intellectual property. They are known as a brand, as it were. They also don't have an external proprietor who's pressurising them to turn a profit. They should be a profitable business, but the profits should be ploughed back into the club, so they ultimately it becomes more cost effective. I mean, there are different trade-offs. The most common model is to have something that's expensive to be a member of, but then very cheap to use. You can flip it the other way around, but it's harder. And they tend to trade far more on their reputation. So what we have now is actually not unusual for clubs, but we are in a sort of period of club resurgence. I mean, there is certainly more than there were even 3 years ago, certainly 10 years ago. And I'm far from a pessimist. I actually think clubs generally are doing very, very well. But it's a very mixed picture, and as a guide to Clubland, old and new, and the rituals, I happily, shamelessly commend my book. So happy to turn it over to questions, but thank you very much. I've got the light in my face, so apologies if I don't spot you, but Craig, I think that's a lovely...
Now, you haven't mentioned the Papanui Working Men's Club.
No, I haven't.
I noticed, but more generally speaking, what's your take on working men's clubs?
So
versus
I'm a huge
these
fan
posh
of
knobs clubs.
No, I'm a huge fan of working men's clubs, and if you, anyone who's read my previous book will know I talk a lot about how they directly came out of these Pall Mall clubs. Particularly a chap called the Reverend Henry Solly, who was very, very keen on bringing workers' education through the working men's clubs. He was also very keen on making them dry clubs, which is why he then gets expelled from his own working men's club institute union that he'd founded. But no. The working men's clubs were vast in scale. So whereas the Pall Mall sort of central London clubs peaked around about 1890 to 1910, working men's clubs don't peak until the late 1970s. There are 3,500 of them at their peak. I mean, even today, there are about 1,500 that remain. And yes, the idea was to bring a slice of Pall Mall, so there's a direct link between the two. I do say in the sort of rules of engagement of this book, of what I decided perhaps arbitrarily I should or shouldn't cover, that I'm not including working men's clubs simply to keep it to a manageable number, because if I did, it would be a 20-volume set. And if someone wishes to fund me for such work, we can talk afterwards. But in the absence of that, no, that's the only reason I couldn't cover it. But yes, I think they very much do things in parallel. Indeed, for example, a very good friend of mine is on the committee of Working Men's Club, and all of the issues that they have, from bitchiness on committee to disagreements about the lease, these are all identical to what you see in other scales of premises.
Well, that meat raffle can get pretty controversial.
Yes.
There are, within 5 minutes of us here, at least 6
Sure.
livery companies, 2 or 3 with really impressive buildings. What do you think the livery clubs of London have had any effect on Clubland? Because you could argue
Yes.
that they are predecessors. I know that there are at least 3 of us in the room who are members.
Yeah, I mean, I showed you a couple of the maps in the book, but because we specially commissioned a whole bunch of these, there is actually a map of the City of London and current and former clubs within that as well. And although there are sort of 3 or 4 historic clubs and then about half a dozen new clubs in the city right now, you're absolutely right to point to the livery companies' sort of relationship between the two. Because obviously the livery companies came first. Most livery companies don't have their own hall. And even when they do have their own hall, it's not the same permanent presence of, I'm going to drop in for a drink. It's very much meeting around certain set-piece dinners several times a year. What happens in the 19th century is a huge revolution in associational culture generally, and different types of associations start to influence one another. So the livery companies, the clubs, the Masonic lodges, groups like the Society of Oddfellows, they're all looking at one another and they're all starting to copy one another's rituals. So clubs become more livery-like, especially in the city, and you also get explicit livery-themed and city-themed clubs. But the livery companies start to have their dinner rituals that evolve during that time as well, directly influenced by the clubs. So it very much is in that latter half of the 19th century when this is exploding.
What's your take on the internet? Because what's happening, you're getting some entrepreneurs who moving from club to club, and they have a massive following. So what they do is they invite sometimes just a few people to some clubs, but other times they get like 1,000 people turning up to a 100 place venue, purely because of their name, and it's affecting Clubland quite differently.
Yeah, I mean, there's something you've sort of touched on there, which is the Instagram trend.
It's also linked to LinkedIn.
It is linked to
You
LinkedIn.
can see
but,
what they do.
But I think the Instagram side of it is something that clubs are not terribly happy about because, well, firstly, nobody likes being an object. Nobody likes being, we really want to see it, we really, really want to see it inside your club. Can we photograph? Can we photograph? We're lost now. That's fine. We're not interested anymore. And that's it. And clubs do not want to be reduced to being a third-rate film set. They don't want to be treated as a thing for somebody's entertainment and for their Instagram background to be discarded. And that is actually an issue. I mean, you get it particularly with people taking selfies in the loos and so on. But you can see why clubs are increasingly, in a way they weren't maybe even 10 or 20 years ago, increasingly strict about photographs for precisely that reason. Indeed. And so I think part of it is treating clubs as a commodity. And some of it is also around, there is a cultural tension between these business, sort of modern business-oriented clubs and the more sort of traditional clubs. Where you see it in a particularly big way is around the concierge approach of modern clubs. And what I mean by that is that a lot of modern clubs very much are run as conciergeries. And I'm not knocking concierges who do their job very well, but it's a very different point to a club. Because the point of a concierge is to satisfy your every need as much as possible to the exclusion of others, if needs be. And that is not the point of a club. A club is inherently a compromise. If you're a member of a club, you probably dislike some of the items on the menu. You probably dislike some of your fellow members, hopefully not most. You probably disagree with some committee decisions that have been taken, but you can make your peace and you can say, I'm happy to be a part of this club nonetheless. I have a voice, I can be involved in its affairs in that way. Where clubs have started to say, we will offer you unlimited luxury to the exclusion of all else, and they're in a bidding war with other clubs doing that, doesn't make for very agreeable members, I would suggest. It doesn't make for selflessness. It doesn't make for conviviality. And that's actually become a real issue. So it's a slightly tangential point, but it very much is tied to what you were saying on how the internet is used. Clubs are not anti-tech. I mean, there are about half a dozen that refuse adamantly to have a website, for instance.
But you also get clubs that seal sections off so that people don't mix with other groups. And they don't want people mixed with other sections.
Well, I mean, I think what's more common is that you'll have a public part of the website and a private part of the website, and you'll say, well, these are the resources. But yeah.
Yeah, well, obviously, London Clubland is, you've read about that. But just as by way of preference, which, if you had a place to go to, the top three maybe, or our three, which would you feel?
Yes.
I have a small supplementary to that as well, which is obviously talk about London Clubland. But the clubs in St Albans, there's one in Norwich and Ipswich, which I'm sure you're aware of. Just a little few thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, but I'll be quicker on the first one because I get asked a lot variations on top clubs, best clubs, and so on. I adamantly refuse to answer that. And genuinely, no insult intended, but I think it's a meaningless question because how do you begin to compare some of these places? When something has, 100 bedrooms and something is just one room, how do you even begin to say, well...
I said preference.
No, indeed.
Yeah.
But the thing is, what I try and do as a result of that is to appreciate clubs on the basis of what they offer. And sure, there are ones I prefer and there are ones I'm less keen on, but I'm not here to do a Michelin guide. I'm very much interested in them as historical oddities and what they say about the human condition. On your second question, really, that's a really interesting point about provincial club life used to be much, much bigger across the UK. It used to be the norm that not only every small town would have a club of its own, but all the big cities would have anything between half a dozen and a dozen. You went to somewhere like Leeds, Manchester, Liverpool, Bristol, they all had at least a dozen clubs. Some of them have one or two still left. But yeah, it's a dying breed, I'm afraid.
How does where we live, we've got very ornate buildings, no longer used for it, but you come into it, was the Mechanics Institute. So
Yes.
would that have been part of the club? How did they
Well,
blend into it?
that's
It's now
sort
a
of-
hotel, but it's still there and big, so a very magnificent building actually.
So that fits very much into what Minnie was asking about, which is this profusion of different forms of associational culture in the 19th century, you're starting to get things like Boy Scouts and Girl Guides. You're starting to get things like sports clubs that are set up. You're starting to get public libraries, but also private libraries. And these mechanical institutes are all part of that. It's a professionalisation. It's setting up more establishments, setting up rules to govern these things in that way. In fact, very often, if it's a small organisation, it's very informally governed. The bigger it is, the more governance it needs, so the more likely they are to set things down in that way. But yes, they will very often have club-like rituals and club-like dinners and facilities, but they wouldn't have considered themselves a club because they saw themselves as first and foremost professional, and they had a social side to them as well. Charles first, and then.
Thank you, Seth. Thank you for an interesting talk. I perambulated here through the former London borough of Holborn. There was a tricky bit with zebra crossing and a large group of men with stripy trousers. I noticed that your trousers go all the way to your shoes. There's no half measures there. They were also carrying cases that could have contained, well, weaponry, frankly, in different pieces, long and flat. My point is, do you think, you mentioned working men's clubs as an aside, you haven't mentioned religious clubs and masonry at all. Do you think they are a parallel story to Clubland in terms of rise and fall?
So two separate
Do you think
things.
they've had an impact?
On religious clubs, they were relatively rare, actually. You would have things like the National Club, which styled itself, it still exists as a dining society in the Carlton, but it saw itself as part of a Protestant crusade against the threats of Catholicism and Judaism in 1840s Britain. They were regarded as fairly minority pursuits, so there were religious clubs. But actually religion in clubs hasn't tended to be something that expressed itself. I suspect because they were seen as leisure organisations, first and foremost, and not a place of serious scholarly study in that way and serious pensive thought. Your second question about Freemasons, there is a link in terms of there are clubs which are more Freemason-centred than others, but actually, because Freemasonry stretches back several centuries before clubs even existed, they are really very different traditions trying to do different things. So, although you'll have, I think actually Freemasonry becomes more of an issue in clubs, it becomes more popular when clubs are in their declining years in the 20th century. When they are a convenient set of facilities to meet in. But then again, it's often a more contractual relationship. It's often a convenient meeting place rather than the main event or direct overlap in that way. So I do think they're quite different things. Yes, you had up.
It's just, I wanted to ask you about the Soho House Group, the
Sure.
so-called MAC Club. When you have a club that very much becomes an international thing, it's very much a mass company. Of course, recently it's been floated, it's been sold off. And I know at least one founder member who became very rapidly aggrieved at the fact that there was no exclusivity whatsoever. And now it's being floated and mass sold. Is that the future of clubs, that they become this commodified mass thing? And if so, do you think that's a good thing?
Well, Soho House, I'm not sure is a representative story of anything. I mean, you're absolutely right that they were floated on the stock exchange, and it wasn't a particularly happy experience. They've actually just gone back to being a privately owned club again, just in the last couple of weeks, in fact, last month. The tension that they expressed was, our shareholders expect us as a business to keep expanding and expanding and expanding. And our members keep saying, we're waiting 45 minutes for a drink. We would rather you see to the essentials of just running the club well. And to be fair, their response has been, well, that is exactly what we've been trying to prioritise. And as part of that, they wanted to no longer be a publicly traded company. So I think that's probably regarded even by them as an experiment that failed. I do think there's a sort of future in terms of wider networks and groups, but there are some questionable examples of how that's been carried out in the past. I'm not sure Soho House is a particularly good template. I mean, I get the impression that the original one was actually a rather jolly place in its sort of 90s heyday, and actually the first extra one they set up in New York was meant to be rather jolly as well. But when you are a chain of 43 plus a dozen workspaces plus lots of other things. Well, again, there are some clubs where that works very well, and others where it doesn't. I mean, if you are primarily a boozing club for people to get drunk, it's probably not a good idea. On the other hand, there are a number of clubs that have ample space for children's playgrounds and have a sort of country club and even a children's club within that, and they've made that work really, really well. But you have to sort of take a long, hard look at yourself and say, we're working in a Georgian building here, this may not work very well.
Would you join one with children?
No, but that's because I can't stand them. You're asking the wrong person.
Just one or two more questions, James.
I just wondering, take a hypothetical now, people who don't yet have a pub now, what sort of investment do you think would be needed to turn that group of people into a proper club and sustain itself for at least 3 years?
I mean, 2,500 would be quite a large club. You know, the average in London is about 1,500. The average on the continent or in North America is actually about 500, give or take a couple of hundred. So you could probably do quite a lot there, especially if they were prepared to pay a reasonable amount up front. But the first priority would actually be securing premises, and frankly, you want to buy the freehold. If you're messing around with short-term leases, it's going to be a hand-to-mouth existence. The chances are you're going to be booted out within 5 to 10 years, and then it'll be a sort of peripatetic existence. So you want to look at where you can buy, and I think one of the classic mistakes a lot of these clubs now make is they say, well, clubs are a West End Mayfair thing. We must buy in Mayfair, where some of the most expensive real estate prices on earth are, competing with international hedge funds. It's not surprising that clubs go bust, and indeed usually it's actually the cost of the premises. It's the single biggest thing they have to worry about. So I wouldn't worry too much about being in the most prestigious bit of town. I'd find a nice place that's worth going out of your way for, even if it is slightly out of the way, and just making sure it's really nice. I mean, I have a club in the north of England where I'm only there a couple of times a year, but it's worth my belonging to it, and I really, really enjoy my visits there. And I think that sort of model is actually quite viable. So unless you have some enormous bequest or funding to begin with, look realistically at living with your means as to what can we afford to buy, and then you're looking at what can we do over several decades rather than what's the next 5-10 year plan.
Legitimate supplementary to that,
Sure.
but is the strength you would see in the longevity of a lot of more structured older clubs, with how the committee has run those clubs to give them that basis as a financial platform to work to? So, and I'll just bring this in because I want an answer. White's compared to anything else around it, with its history, how that's been able to continue when others have failed?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question, and I don't think the committee setup is inherently actually a better run system. And the reason I say that is the important thing is the member-owned part rather than the landlord-owned part. Funnily enough, the member-owned part is really, really very good when you're expanding. It actually causes real problems when you're on your way down, partly because of the risk of demutualisation. There's a very common cause of club closures, which is the members look around and they say, well, this was built for 3,000 people, but there are only 150 of us left. Our share of this is worth quite a lot, and the real estate price of this building, purchased 150 years ago, is actually rather more than it was then. We can retire on the proceeds of this, and that has happened, including relatively recently. So the thing about being member-owned is you need robust governance. The committee structure can be terrific, but it can also be incredibly dysfunctional, and clubs all over London will periodically have their issues and their bust-ups and so on. Interesting enough, I don't think there's such a thing as an ideal model. I think there's such a thing as an ideal committee member. I think there's such a thing as an ideal participant in that. Sometimes a club works really well as a benevolent dictatorship. You typically think of that as being when it's a proprietary club, but very often it actually works in a member-owned club. That said, I can guarantee you the worst run clubs of all are the ones that are trying to be a benevolent dictatorship. And the people who are doing that don't know that they're really, really bad at it. So this is the problem. It's not that that inherently works, it's that actually you do need robust governance and checks and balances, but then you'll get certain personality types turning up at the AGM, which I touched on earlier, which will take us full circle. But I'm aware you'll want to be getting in more drinks, but I'm very happy to. We can keep chatting. Just are we still recording? Or
Dr. Thévoz, Regina, well done.